The February morning air still clung to my jacket as I walked up the driveway, sweat drying along my spine from the familiar hour-long routine I'd repeated for more than a decade. At 62, the rhythm of walking had become the last dependable thing in my life. An anchor, a ritual, a reminder that the world could still make sense if I kept moving one foot in front of the other. But all that sense shattered the moment I saw the truck. A budget rental truck, squat and white, sat planted across my driveway like a misplaced tombstone. Its box frame blocked the garage completely. For a second, I wondered if it was for a neighbor. Wrong driveway, wrong house, wrong universe. But the realization hit before the denial could finish forming. It was parked over my concrete, angled with the casual arrogance of someone who believed they had the right to be there. I stopped at the sidewalk, pulse quickening. Not from exertion, not anymore. Something colder slid under my ribs. The front door was open. Not wide, not welcoming, just ajar. Carelessly, disrespectfully, the way you leave a pantry door when you're grabbing something that doesn't belong to you. Inside, the living room I had known for 15 years. The room I'd painted myself one sweltering summer. The room where my wife had once fallen asleep on the couch with a mystery novel draped over her lap. Was unrecognizable. Boxes. Everywhere. Tall columns of cardboard, faintly leaning like they expected gravity to forgive them. Stacks shoved against the walls that I once took pride in painting a warm cedar gray. My furniture, the sectional sofa I'd saved 6 months overtime for, the oak coffee table I'd built with my own hands, the floor lamp whose soft light had comforted me through every lonely night, had been pushed aside to make room for what looked like the early stages of an invasion. Two strangers stood in the middle of the chaos. The man was thick around the chest, stocky, his gray hair thinning at the top. He wore a polo shirt, the color of dust, tucked into jeans that were hoisted so high on his waist they threatened to touch his ribs. His voice filled the room the way mold fills damp wood, subtly at first, then suffocatingly. "That one goes upstairs," he boomed at my son, as if directing hired movers. The woman beside him wore a sour expression carved permanently onto her face. She clutched a box marked fragile and examined it like it had personally offended her. Too much perfume clouded the air around her, a floral scent so thick it clawed at the back of my throat. My son brushed past them, carrying a box labeled kitchen in black marker. His face was red, exertion, embarrassment, or guilt. Hard to tell. Behind him, my daughter-in-law, Sarah, finally looked up, hands dusted with cardboard grit. "Oh, you're back," she said casually. As if I had been gone for days, not an hour. I stepped inside, shutting them on. Front door behind me with a quiet click. My voice came out level, too controlled even for me. "What is going on here?" Sarah tilted her head, that tilt I had come to dread. It always preceded something manipulative, something polished, something she knew I would not like but planned to say anyway. "Dad, didn't Daniel tell you?" Her voice dropped into that falsely warm tone she used when she wanted to wrap poison in politeness. "My parents sold their house. The closing is complicated. They need a place to stay for a few months." "A few months." The phrase slithered into my ears. "It'll be fine," she added. "We're all family." The word family felt like a slap, the kind given with a smile. I looked at Daniel. He had just set the box down with a dull resignation. "Daniel?" My voice was sharper now. He didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, his eyes darted away quickly. "Dad, I was going to tell you, things happened fast." "Fast," I repeated softly. "Fast enough that strangers are moving into my house without asking me?" "It's our house, too." His voice was too quiet to be confident, too rehearsed to be spontaneous. "Sarah and I live here. We make decisions together." I stared at him in disbelief. This was the same son who had lived here rent-free for 2 years. The same son whose job I helped him get. The same son whose college loans I paid off quietly without telling him. The stranger man, Henry, I would learn, took a seat in my recliner. My chair, the one molded to the shape of my spine after 8 years of use. He dropped into it with a groan of satisfaction, as if he were claiming territory. This recliner's seen better days, he announced loudly. When did you buy it? The 80s? 8 years ago, I said. Feels older. He chuckled, patting the armrest. You should upgrade it while we're here. I said nothing. He mistook that silence for weakness. Rose swept through my kitchen next, opening cabinets, rearranging dishes, clucking her tongue at the placement of bowls and cups as if she owned the place. The rest of the day passed in a haze of violations. I retreated to my bedroom, the last remaining space untouched, temporarily. Behind the closed door, I pulled out the fireproof safe and retrieved the deed to the house. My name. Only my name. No Sarah. No Daniel. No strangers. I had paid every mortgage bill for 15 years, surviving layoffs, inflation, and the crushing loneliness after losing my wife. I had earned these walls, every nail, every tile, every inch. That clarity steadied something in me. Dinner brought humiliation. We all sat around the table I had built myself. Henry talked nonstop, criticizing the temperature, calling the house outdated, loudly suggesting house rules. Rose complained the guest room was too small. Sarah comforted her mother, with touch and tone, ignoring the way my jaw tightened. Daniel said nothing. Later in the garage, I cornered him. Son, why didn't you talk to me? He stared at the tools hanging on the pegboard. It just happened fast. Dad, they needed help. A few months, I muttered. In my house, without asking. It's our house, too, he repeated, brushing past me. But it wasn't. Not legally, not morally, not in any universe that valued respect. That night, unable to sleep, I went to the kitchen. The cabinet where I kept my mugs had been rearranged. My wife's blue ceramic mug, simple, irreplaceable, was pushed to the back. Rose's floral teacup sat proudly in its place. I stood in the dark holding that blue mug. The tile was cold under my feet. Something inside me crystallized. Not rage. Rage burns. This was cold, precise, methodical. The kind of clarity I had honed over 35 years in logistics management. A problem, a system, a solution waiting to be calculated. They thought I was old. They thought I was weak. They thought they could overrun my home, my life, my dignity. They were wrong. I placed the mug back exactly where Rose had moved it. Tomorrow they would violate new boundaries. But tonight I had learned exactly who I was dealing with and what needed to be done. The days that followed were a lesson in patience, observation, and quiet calculation. They believed their presence in my house was temporary, trivial, that I would tolerate their constant intrusions because I was retired, alone, flexible. They didn't know me. They didn't know that for 35 years I had managed logistics operations where precision, timing, and anticipation weren't just skills. They were survival tools. Every small act they committed was data. Every casual violation a pattern to be logged, measured, and eventually countered. Monday began with the thermostat. Henry had touched it at least 6 times by 7 a.m., each adjustment moving it slightly lower or higher than I had set it the night before. By the third adjustment, I could feel the chill settling into my bones, not unlike the first bite of winter creeping through an open window. I noted each change, each pattern, 66, 68, 72, then down again. Each nudge a minor assertion of dominance, a subtle test. I did nothing. Instead, I watched, silent and calculating, while Rose spread her perfumes and powders across the bathroom counters, displacing my carefully arranged toiletries. I counted each bottle. Lavender lotion in the middle shelf, pink blush moved to the top, my razor shoved to the back. She thought she was decorating. I knew she was marking territory. Daniel and Sarah remained oddly compliant. Daniel avoided my eyes more than usual, shuffling boxes with quiet diligence. Sarah spoke with that same rehearsed efficiency, offering explanations for everything from why my mail had been opened to why my leftover pasta had disappeared. By Tuesday, the invasion had escalated. I returned from my morning walk to find the leftover pasta from Monday night gone. Henry was in my chair again, chewing with the casual satisfaction of someone convinced they had every right to consume another man's meal. Good, he said. Make more. The audacity of it could have sparked rage in someone else. In me, it sparked clarity. I began to observe methodically. Every intrusion, every petty assertion of control became a data point. Favorite mug hidden, Wednesday. Parking space taken, every morning without exception. Mail opened, Thursday at 11:32 a.m., according to the postmark on the envelope I retrieved from the trash. Temperature adjusted at 6:47 a.m., 7:03 a.m., and 7:58 a.m. daily. Food stolen Monday and Wednesday. I cataloged these mentally, tracing patterns, calculating probable future violations, and planning subtle responses. By Wednesday night, I had begun to reclaim the narrative. Not overtly, not in anger, in small, precise ways. I rearranged some of the boxes Henry and Rose had stacked, using their own labels to misdirect them. The fragile boxes ended up at the bottom of the pile, the light ones at the top, a minor inconvenience that would irritate them subtly. I adjusted the thermostat back to 70 degrees after Henry had turned it to 66. When they noticed, I simply said, "I thought it was getting too cold." The statement was neutral, almost benign, but it planted the seed. I was aware. I was present. Sarah continued her role as enforcer, explaining every intrusion as necessary or temporary, but her carefully constructed facade began to crack. One evening, I caught her whispering to Daniel, her eyes darting nervously when Henry barked instructions about organizing the pantry. I took note. The cracks would widen. Thursday morning brought a new violation, the sleeping arrangements. I descended the stairs to find all 5 adults in the kitchen, unusually awake. Normally, Daniel and Sarah wouldn't rise before 7:30. Henry would lounge until 8. Rose would move at her own slow pace. But today, they had waited for me. They had planned. "Dad, we need to talk about sleeping arrangements," Sarah began, voice rehearsed, posture rigid. "With 5 adults in the house, we are running out of space. You could sleep on the couch, or perhaps a hotel would be more comfortable." I set down my coffee with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment before responding. 5 adults, exactly. This house has 3 bedrooms. Daniel and I have 1. My parents have the guest room. You have the master. You want me to leave my bedroom? Henry chimed in, dismissing decades of my contribution, my investment, my life. "We're just being practical," he said. "You're retired, you have time. The rest of us have jobs, responsibilities. Makes sense for you to find somewhere else temporarily. Maybe permanently we could come to some arrangement." The audacity, the cold, calculated imposition. I said nothing. Not yet. Instead, I observed. The position of the sun on the kitchen table, the way the coffee cups were aligned to him, the way Rose's floral teacup towered over my simple blue mug, it all became data. Every act of entitlement they committed would be stored, processed, and eventually returned to them in a form they could not ignore. Thursday evening, after they had dispersed to their respective corners of the house, I retrieved the blue mug from its hiding place. I ran my fingers along its rim, tracing the memories embedded in its glaze. 20 years of Christmas mornings, anniversaries, late-night conversations with my wife before she passed, quiet moments of reflection when I thought the house was mine alone. The mug was a symbol, small but irreplaceable. I set it back carefully, in plain sight, a reminder. Friday was the first day I began to assert subtle control. Henry had taken my usual parking spot again. I moved my car slightly to the side, leaving it closer to the curb. When he saw it, he grumbled, muttered about inconvenience. I responded with nothing but measured politeness. "It's morning rush hour. Space is tight." In the pantry, I quietly shifted Rose's collection of rose-scented soaps, lotions, and perfumes. Not enough to ruin her, not enough to provoke immediate retaliation, but enough to disrupt her sense of order, to plant the notion that she was not the sole authority here. Daniel and Sarah began to notice these small disruptions. The first night, Daniel asked quietly, "Dad, did you move something?" I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that conveys warmth but hides intention. "Just keeping track of the house, making sure things are in their right places." He frowned, sensing the shift, but not yet comprehending its scope. By Saturday, the invasion had solidified, but so had my resolve. Every minor violation, thermostat changes, stolen food, rearranged furniture, open mail, was now cataloged in my mind as part of a larger pattern. I could predict when Henry would adjust the thermostat, when Rose would interfere with my belongings, even when Sarah would attempt to rationalize their behavior to Daniel. I slept lightly that night, listening to the subtle creaks of the floorboards as they moved through the house. Each step was a note in a symphony of control that I would soon conduct. Rage would not serve me. Force would not serve me. Precision would. Planning would. Patience would. And in that patience, I found clarity. I was not a man to be pushed aside, dismissed, or humiliated. They believed this house was theirs for a few months. I believed it was mine forever. And when the time came, they would understand the cost of underestimating me. By Sunday morning, the house had taken on a strange rhythm, one that was not mine, but that I had begun to map like a blueprint. Every movement, every casual assumption of authority by Henry and Rose was predictable. I could anticipate when Henry would stretch into my recliner, when Rose would leave a trail of floral scent through the hallway, when Sarah would feign concern for her parents while quietly undermining my authority. Every behavior was a piece on a board, every day a turn in a game I intended to win. It began with the small things, minor adjustments, subtle corrections. I didn't act overtly, but I became a ghost in the house, a silent presence that watched and noted everything. My footsteps were quieter than the wind through the windows. My eyes caught every misplacement, every violation, every arrogance disguised as family necessity. Henry, convinced of his dominance, strutted through the living room at 7:15 a.m., coffee in hand, adjusting the thermostat mid-conversation with Daniel. "It's too cold in here," he announced, as if the house owed him comfort. I observed silently, letting him finish, noting the exact temperature when he first touched the dial. 66 degrees. I waited. The dial moved up to 72 degrees, then back down to 68 degrees. Back up. A cycle of control, repeated like a mantra. I recorded it mentally, committing each shift to memory. Rose, meanwhile, had discovered my spice rack and begun rearranging it according to what she believed to be logical order. Salt and sugar on the top shelf, my carefully labeled spices pushed to the middle. I didn't intervene immediately. Instead, I observed her pride in her work, the way she stepped back and inhaled the aroma of her perfumed success. Sarah hovered nearby, offering verbal nods of encouragement, her posture impeccable, almost military. "That looks much better, Mom," she said, her tone clipped, professional. The words were hollow, the effort performative, but I noticed the subtle anxiety in her eyes, a crack in their armor. By midday, I began to test boundaries, not recklessly, but with calculated precision. I moved one of the cardboard boxes Henry had stacked too high, placing it where it would block his path from the living room to the kitchen. I didn't say a word. I simply observed the disruption. Henry's foot caught the edge of the box. He swore under his breath, a low, frustrated murmur that didn't reach my ears directly, but vibrated through the house. Rose scowled, adjusting a teacup on the counter for symmetry. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance. I allowed a faint smile. Small victories, imperceptible to most, but they were the first moves in a longer strategy. The next day, I began subtle manipulations in the kitchen. I rearranged the contents of the refrigerator. The left side, usually dominated by leftovers and my prepared meals, now contained Rose's labeled bottles and prepackaged food. My pasta and other staples were shifted to the right, behind containers and jars that required effort to move. A minor inconvenience, yes, but one that would force repeated acknowledgement of my presence. Daniel noticed first. "Dad, did you move my pasta?" I shrugged innocently. I thought it might be easier to access the condiments. He hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his features. That hesitation was currency. I banked it. Henry and Rose were creatures of habit, creatures of routine. I began tracking their comings and goings, their preferences, the unspoken rules they assumed were absolute. Every minor annoyance I introduced was measured and tested. a shifted spice jar, a subtly adjusted thermostat, a misaligned chair. These were my pawns, my test pieces in the unfolding game. One evening, I allowed Henry to occupy the recliner while I quietly removed a small, seemingly insignificant screw from its base. Nothing dangerous, just enough to make the chair slightly unstable. Henry didn't notice immediately. He sat, leaned back, and there was a slight wobble. He shifted uncomfortably, unaware of the cause. Rose noticed. "Careful," she warned, glancing at me as if the misalignment were my doing. I smiled faintly. No words. Observation only. Planting doubt. By midweek, their confidence began to falter. Subtle acts of manipulation accumulate. Anxiety creeps in where arrogance once reigned. They hadn't realized I was no ordinary occupant. I was not the passive, retired man they assumed I to be. Even Daniel began to notice changes, small inconsistencies in their behavior. The way Henry hesitated before adjusting the thermostat, the way Rose's movements through the kitchen became careful, almost timid. Sarah tried to maintain her authority, but found herself second-guessing. I began introducing deliberate unpredictability. One morning, I set the thermostat lower than Henry usually preferred, not enough to be uncomfortable, merely noticeable. I left a note by the coffee machine. Thought it might be chilly, adjust if necessary. A casual acknowledgement of their authority, yet a subtle reminder. I am watching. They reacted exactly as expected. Henry muttered complaints under his breath. Rose sniffed the air and frowned. Sarah intervened verbally, smoothing tensions with rehearsed efficiency. All of it, predictable. All of it, calculable. By Friday, I escalated. I began misplacing items intentionally. Rose's favorite floral teacup appeared on a high shelf just out of reach. Henry's keys were relocated within the house. Minor irritations, but cumulative. Slowly, methodically, the invaders were learning that their assumed control was not absolute. That evening, Daniel approached me quietly. "Dad, what are you doing?" I gave him a faint smile, almost imperceptible. Observing, planning, correcting, nothing more. The truth was, it was far more than observation. Every small act of disruption, every subtle redirection of their movements, every tiny challenge to their dominance was the opening phase of a long game, and I was the only player who understood all the rules. By Sunday night, the house had become a chessboard. Henry and Rose had occupied positions, confident and arrogant, unaware of the subtle forces at work. Sarah, torn between loyalty to her parents and to me, was a hesitant pawn, her uncertainty growing. Daniel, silent and conflicted, was a rook trapped in the corner, observing the shifts but unable to intervene. I sat in the shadows of the living room, cataloging each movement, each flaw in their assumptions, each crack in their confidence. This was not about anger. It was about precision, patience, and inevitability. I had learned who they were, and the game was only beginning. Monday morning arrived like a challenge. The air was colder than usual, but I didn't notice it, not really. I had stopped reacting to the temperature, the sounds, the small irritations. Instead, I observed them. Every tiny movement, every casual assumption of entitlement. And now it was time to act. The first move was subtle. I began with the thermostat. Henry had grown accustomed to adjusting it multiple times a day, each time asserting his control over the environment. I left it at 68 degrees F overnight, knowing that by morning he would reach to adjust it. But I had placed a small but noticeable obstruction behind the dial, an invisible reminder of my presence. When Henry twisted the knob at 7:02 a.m., it moved only halfway before resistance halted him. "Strange," he muttered. He twisted again. Nothing. He frowned. I heard the click in my head as he realized eventually that the control he assumed was absolute was suddenly limited. Rose appeared in the doorway shortly after, perfume clouding the hallway like a fog. She looked at the dial, then at me. "Did you do something?" she asked, a small crack in her practiced veneer. I smiled faintly. "Just a little adjustment," I said. Neutral. Calm. But the statement was a warning. You are no longer in charge. The next move was in the kitchen. Over the past week, Rose had rearranged my cupboards and my pantry, as though she were the architect of the house. I began subtle reversals. I moved her carefully labeled bottles of rose-scented lotions to the opposite side of the counter. I stacked her herbal teas on top of containers she hadn't touched, forcing her to reach, to bend, to acknowledge that she was no longer the only person shaping the environment. She noticed? Of course she noticed. Her eyes narrowed, a flash of frustration that she attempted to mask with a polite smile. Sarah hovered nearby, trying to explain it away. Dad, it's just for easier access. Mom always complains she can't reach the top shelf. I nodded. I thought I'd help her with that. Daniel, standing silently, watched. He was beginning to see the subtle shifts, the beginnings of my strategy. By Tuesday, the tactics escalated. I began to claim the house with precision. Henry had moved his truck into my usual parking spot again. I pulled my car around the side, leaving just enough space to inconvenience him. When he muttered, I responded casually, I thought the curb might be better for visibility. A simple statement, but enough to disrupt his perception of control. In the bedrooms, I began minor manipulations that would grow more meaningful over the following days. I moved Rose's dresser slightly, enough that she had to adjust her footing to open drawers. Small shifts in her environment were psychological reminders. This house was not hers to command. The real leverage, however, was in the kitchen and dining areas. Over the next few days, I deliberately misarranged items, subtly replacing Rose's floral teacups with my simple blue mug in prominent positions. Each time she reached for her favorite cup and found it missing, the irritation grew. Henry's coffee habits were disrupted similarly, with sugar and cream subtly moved to inconvenient spots. I watched them, taking careful notes in my mind. Their reliance on order, their obsession with comfort, their assumption that I would tolerate their intrusions. These were vulnerabilities. Each disruption, each minor inconvenience, began to erode their confidence. By Thursday, I began to push the boundaries more boldly. I accidentally left the guest room door open, allowing a draft to chill the room Henry's parents had claimed as their temporary domain. Rose noticed immediately. "It's freezing in here," she exclaimed. I replied with measured calm, "I thought you might like a cool morning breeze." Later, I removed a small, seemingly insignificant screw from the base of Henry's recliner. It was stable enough to sit in, but anyone leaning back fully would notice a slight wobble. I left it for him to discover, knowing that the slightest uncertainty in his comfort would plant seeds of doubt. Meanwhile, I began reclaiming control over the household rituals. I prepared my own meals, carefully portioned, ensuring that my presence and authority were unmissable. When leftovers disappeared, Henry's favorite act of petty dominance, I noted the time and the person responsible. Patterns emerged. Daniel started noticing. One evening, he approached me quietly in the garage. "Dad, they're noticing your moves. They're starting to adjust." I smiled faintly, eyes shadowed by thought. Exactly. Observation first. Disruption second. Patience always. The true beauty of this approach was in its invisibility. No confrontation, no anger. Just small, precise actions that accumulated like snow, eventually burying their assumptions under the weight of reality. By Friday, Henry began to hesitate in the morning routine, unsure when to move, when to speak, when to assert dominance. Rose's perfume seemed more desperate, her movements precise but cautious. Sarah, once confident in her corporate efficiency, now second-guessed every instruction she gave. And Daniel finally began to understand the lesson I was teaching, the subtle reclamation of authority that was unfolding before his eyes. Evenings became strategic meetings in my mind. I planned each minor violation, each redirection, each tiny disruption that would accumulate into a crescendo of awareness for Henry and Rose. Each action was deliberate. Each reaction was calculated. I was no longer merely a passive observer. I was the architect of the psychological landscape. Saturday morning, I executed one of my boldest maneuvers. I subtly rearranged all the personal items in the bathroom, including toiletries, towels, and even bath mats. Nothing dangerous, just enough to disrupt routine and force attention. When Rose discovered it, her expression was one of irritation mixed with disbelief. Henry noticed the slight misalignment of his towels and muttered complaints. Sarah tried to mediate, and Daniel watched, comprehension dawning in his eyes. I observed them all, quiet and steady, the calm epicenter of chaos. The house was mine, legally and morally. Emotionally and psychologically, I was beginning to reclaim it as well. The balance of power had begun to shift, imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. And as I sat in my recliner that evening, my hands wrapped around my late wife's simple blue mug, I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction. The first moves of my retaliation were complete. The game was no longer theoretical. Henry, Rose, and Sarah had underestimated me. They had assumed that age, retirement, and silence equaled weakness. They were learning slowly that every move they made was being observed, cataloged, and countered. Every intrusion had a response, every violation a consequence. The slow burn of strategy, patience, and psychological dominance was underway, and I was ready for the next phase. By Sunday morning, the house had changed. Not physically, walls and floors remained the same, but the energy, the rhythm, the sense of authority had shifted. For 15 years, I had lived here quietly, often alone, often unnoticed, my presence taken for granted. The past 2 weeks had reminded me of one simple truth. A home is only yours if you claim it every day, every moment, without hesitation. Henry and Rose had begun to falter. The small disruptions, the deliberate rearrangements, the minor inconveniences, all meticulously calculated, had begun to erode their confidence. Henry's strut through the living room had become a cautious walk. Rose's perfume lingered less aggressively, her movements slower, her posture slightly hesitant. Sarah's polished efficiency had begun to crack, her suggestions softer, her tone uncertain. Daniel, silent but increasingly attentive, was no longer a passive observer. He was beginning to grasp the balance of power in our home. I chose that morning to escalate, not with rage, not with confrontation, but with undeniable authority. The first act was simple. I reclaimed the living room. The recliner, my chair, had been Henry's domain since day one of the invasion. I sat in it before he awoke, curling into its familiar contours. When Henry shuffled into the room at 7:03 a.m., coffee in hand, his confident grin faltered. I looked up calmly, meeting his gaze, unflinching. "Good morning," I said evenly. "I thought I'd enjoy the sunrise from my favorite spot." Henry froze, his coffee trembled slightly in his hand. No words came. He shifted, uncomfortably aware that the chair was no longer his dominion, that I had silently reclaimed it without a word, a fight, or even a glance of irritation. Rose appeared soon after, moving through the kitchen in her usual precise fashion, only to find her floral teacups again replaced by my blue mug. Center stage, impossible to ignore. She froze, lips pursed, glancing between me and her daughter. "Why?" she began, but I ignored her, pouring myself coffee and savoring the familiar warmth. Sarah cleared her throat, trying to maintain control. "Dad, maybe we should discuss the schedule." I looked at her calmly. "We can discuss it, but first let's acknowledge something. This house is mine. I paid for it, lived in it, maintained it, and kept it standing long before anyone decided to move in without asking. Everyone here is a guest, temporarily, until we reach a proper understanding. That understanding starts with respect." Daniel, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Dad, you're right. They've overstepped. We let them assume control too easily." His voice carried a hint of relief, a recognition finally dawning. Henry tried to argue. "We're just trying to help. It's only for a few months." I tilted my head slightly, calculating, calm. Help is offered, not imposed. Guests follow the rules of the house, not the other way around. The air shifted. A subtle tension replaced the previous arrogance in their demeanor. They realized suddenly that the game had changed. Over the next several days, I continued to reclaim my home, each move deliberate. The thermostat was now set exclusively to my comfort. Any attempts at adjustment were politely but firmly countered. Rose's perfume and lotions were moved to less prominent locations, symbolic but effective, a psychological reminder that she was no longer in charge. Personal items, mail, and kitchenware were placed where they belonged, in full view, establishing authority without confrontation. Meals were portioned according to my household rules, my preferences unchallenged. Daniel observed and gradually participated. He began to remind Henry and Rose of the house rules, echoing my authority. Sarah, at first conflicted, slowly realigned herself to my expectations, understanding the natural order that had always existed. One evening, after everyone had settled into the house, I walked through each room, mentally checking the adjustments, observing the subtle deference that had emerged. Henry no longer claimed my recliner without hesitation. Rose moved carefully through the kitchen, mindful of my presence. Sarah spoke with less rehearsal, more authenticity, and Daniel finally acknowledged the shift without needing to say it aloud. I sat in my recliner, holding my blue mug, reflecting on the past 2 weeks. This had never been about anger or vengeance. It had been about precision, patience, and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. They had assumed silence meant weakness. They had assumed compliance meant surrender. They had been wrong. The final act was quiet but unmistakable. I prepared dinner in the kitchen, placing each plate deliberately. When they arrived at the table, there was no chaos, no arguments. The subtle order I had restored was evident. They ate in their proper places, aware, if only subconsciously, that the balance had shifted. Henry, once loud and overbearing, spoke softly, deferentially. Rose moved with cautious grace. Sarah finally spoke to me with genuine respect, acknowledging the authority I had always held. Daniel sat across from me, silent but aligned, understanding fully now the lesson that had been played out in small, deliberate steps. I sipped my coffee, savoring the warmth, the comfort, the quiet victory. The house was mine again, not because I had fought with anger, not because I had yelled or demanded, but because I had been patient, methodical, and precise. Every violation, every assumption of control had been countered with intelligence and strategy. I had reclaimed my home. And as I looked around, the late afternoon sun streaming through the living room windows, casting shadows across the furniture, the boxes, the once disorderly spaces, I allowed a quiet satisfaction to settle. They had learned their place. Daniel had learned his role, and I had reaffirmed my own understanding. A home, like life itself, is maintained not through force, but through observation, patience, and the quiet assertion of what is rightfully yours. The intruders, though still present, understood now that this house was not theirs to command. They would never forget, and I would never forget what it meant to defend it, not with anger, but with calculated precision. The game was over. The home was reclaimed, and I, finally, could breathe again.